I told people I slipped out for the lights. That was the version most of them wanted. A woman tired of a room full of polished glasses and polished ideas, drifting outside into the city's Saturday glow to watch chandeliers catch rain. It was prettier than the truth, which was that being seen had become dangerous in a particular way. Not because anyone wanted to harm me physically, but because visibility itself had been weaponized. Every laugh, every staged hand on a waist, every photograph of the perfect marriage I wore like a brooch, fed a market that bought and sold what should have been private. The price was my edges. It was the slow erasure of my capacity to choose. The rain is cold enough to make the sleeves of my dress cling. My hair, arranged earlier by a woman who knows exactly how much volume the cameras like, is collapsing into wet. I stand on the curb because I do not want to be within the reach of the event doors. The room inside had become a theater whose audience and producers were the same people, and I know the exits are all calculated. A man in a tux passes me, head down. The flash of a camera stabs the night. For a moment, I imagine stepping into a taxi and going home to the empty arms of my husband, the marriage everyone applauded, the open window of our public life where charity names and endorsement deals float like framed certificates. But I do not go home. He finds me the way all bargains find their entry point, where someone is unguarded. Dante Moretti has a presence that doesn't announce itself with volume. He arrives as a shadow within a shadow, a coat dark as the wet pavement, his hair still silver at the temples, though the rest of him carries a kind of permanent dusk. You have seen men like him in whispers, the fixer given soft glamour by reputation, the man whose number appears in the right Rolodex when things get messy. He offers no pamphlets, no promises in broad strokes. He uses small, practical words. He says simply, "I can keep you quiet for a week." 1 week, he says, as if the count of days were a measure of both mercy and restraint. A week feels like a modest salvation. I have not been able to sleep properly for months because every social hour folds into a ledger somewhere. Mentions, clips, edited segments. There is an economy of scandal that trades reputations like stocks. I have been under the microscope long enough to know the sort of curiosity that eats quietly at people's lives. Dante gestures to his car, black if that matters, and I step in because I prefer the grit of his shadow to the thin veneer at the gala. The curb talk is not cinematic. There is no whispered oath on a rain-slick street. Dante's offer is a warranty in human form, protection measured in presence, in the rearrangement of attention. He says he can disrupt the market that feeds on me, calibrate, the reputation trading network he names softly, their syllables like a gloss on dangerous machinery.
He says he has eyes across platforms, but he also says something more disarming. I don't do it the old way anymore. He says he will accept oversight. He says, if you will, that the price of my help is not ownership, it is accountability. We draft terms right there in shorthand. He will not order illegal retaliation. He will not allow surveillance of my life without my explicit consent. He will give me access to any footage of me that he has. He will agree to an independent third party, an archivist, who will receive copies of all records and maintain a ledger, a neutral witness to any action taken on my behalf. If any boundary is crossed, I may leave, and leaving will be clean. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just a clear clause, unilateral exit. He presses something into my palm, a key, small and unadorned, a physical punctuation. You keep this, he says. It is yours if you want to leave. The key is absurd, and it is the plainest thing he could have given me. Metal for agency, a small thing, heavy enough to remind. If this kind of moral thriller, small conveniences traded for large moral questions, interests you, stay with this story. The week begins with a house and people who do not belong to the sort of pages that profile a perfect marriage. Dante's house is not a fortress. It wears no heraldic plates. It is a long, low building with a greenhouse off the back, where heat and damp create a soft, forgiving light. Inside, the rooms feel lived in ways my own home does not. There are stacks of paper, well-used mugs, a rug that has been walked on in a straight line for years. You begin to notice the difference between a staged life and a life that tolerates imperfection at once. Rosa meets me first. She is the house manager, not a lady's maid, and her hands are calloused in a way that speaks of hard work rather than pretense. She makes tea in a way that suggests ritual without performance, a measured pour, a cloth over the pot to keep heat in, lemon oil on the counter that smells faintly medicinal and homey at once. Rosa's face holds a kind of kindly resolution. She has seen reputations and things done to them, and she chooses not to be surprised by the fact. Marco, who handles security, is careful with his eyes. He He folds napkins with the same precise calm he brings to checking doors. He is the sort of person who notices patterns in small things and can read a car tire tread in a silhouette. They show me the monitors in a room that smells of paper and lemon oil. The screens are not as cinematic as you expect, a grid of flat images, dates, timestamps, metadata tucked at the bottom like legalese. Dante opens a folder and lays out the rules we had murmured on the curb into clear lines. No surveillance without consent. All footage available to me within 24 hours of its capture. Copy sent immediately to an independent archivist, who will maintain an immutable ledger and an independent copy of any edits or actions taken.
No clandestine recordings of my private conversations. No retaliatory cleanups. A clause that forbids preemptive measures that are extrajudicial in nature. If Dante takes action beyond the written terms, he will submit to the oversight of a third party and make reparations. He uses the term reparations carefully, as if it is a piece of furniture present in the room that none of us can ignore. He says he will accept temporary restrictions on his methods while this week plays out. He signs an agreement before me on a tablet, the text sent simultaneously to the archivist's inbox, an email with a timestamp, not the dramatic flourish of a notarized handshake, but the same transparency. I read the words closely, because this is the language I have been denied in public. My marriage had always been described using adjectives that were not mine. Perfect, seamless, admirable. They painted a life in which every compromise glinted as an asset, but it had been built on a bargain I had not signed. The key he gave me sits in my palm like a promise I can now test. When I hand my signature back on the tablet, I feel something like a temporary recalibration of self. I am reasserting the fact that I can say yes and no, and that those words will matter. Days fold into a domestic rhythm that feels like an experiment. There is the kettle hiss at 8 in the morning, the greenhouse light that softens everything in the late afternoon, the way Rosa moves through rooms with an economy of motion. We make tea, and we discuss banalities as if they are shields. I am struck by how much intimacy can be built from ordinary things, a practice that is not sensational, not public, but small and steady. Dante cooks once, clumsy at first, and Rosa corrects him with good humor. Marco shows me the small things that make a security presence livable, a walkie clipped on low, a pair of shoes always ready by the door. The house becomes a place where privacy is not an ornament to be displayed, but a condition to be preserved. Conversation is limited to certain kinds of honesty. Dante tells me, in pieces, the story of how he came to the work he does. It is not a heroic origin story. He speaks of a mother whose name is rarely printed in the papers, of nights where he learned to see the world in small movements rather than slogans. I do not let his past become a reason for me to absolve him of anything. I hold it instead as context. He has done things before that he admits were wrong. That admission is a necessary but not sufficient gesture. He accepts oversight because he says he has learned the hard way that protecting someone can too easily become possession. A fracture emerges sooner than I would prefer. One night, after we have gone to bed with the windows closed and the greenhouse light a distant glow, I wake with the scratch of unease. The monitor room downstairs clicks and murmurs in a way that is not usual. A sequence of lights pulses, then goes still.
When I ask Dante the next morning about it, he looks almost guilty before he says the word that undoes a part of the agreement: reflex. He is ashamed of the reflex. He confesses that the previous night, without telling me, he checked a feed that included my car pulling into the driveway. He did not intend to watch me in an intimate moment. He meant only to check for threats. But the rule was clear: no surveillance without consent. He did it anyway. He tells me how he sat with the image for a long time and then shut it off. He did not save clips. He did not show anyone. He tells me because he wants me to know that transparency will be his new practice. He says, I made a promise and I broke it. He suggests steps: an audit of access logs, a signed amendment added to our agreement, an immediate message to the archivist with a copy of the access attempt, disciplinary action within his team. He offers more: an additional key, engraved, to show that my right to leave is not symbolic but extra specified. The extra key feels like the right thing to do in a world where tokens matter. I sit with his apology. It's complicated. In my life, the word apology is often performative, the sort politicians hand out in press kits. This one is different, because he takes concrete steps: a ledger entry to the archivist, a notification about the access attempt, a public outline of remedial steps confined to the account of the house. He is not making a speech about his character. He is repairing a breach. I accept the repair with ambivalence. That acceptance does not make him harmless. It makes us both responsible to the new terms. Rosa watches us with something that is neither disapproval nor indulgence. She has seen men who flinch and men who do not. You both do the ledger, she says when Dante offers to take responsibility alone. You both write what you did so someone not on your payroll can see it. Marco, who moves through the house like a steady clock, confirms the access logs on a plate of paper and shows me a record stamped with time and the words unauthorized access, no clip saved. The archivist receives the copy within the hour, an email with a time-stamped attachment that the archivist later confirms via a reply, received and logged. The presence of the archivist is more than a bureaucratic paper trail. It is a person we never meet at first, a neutral ledger that serves as a witness outside our immediate loyalties. The archivist's name appears in our messages as someone who does not have a stake in either Dante's or my reputation. They are, in the best sense, a referee of fact. For the first days, the house feels less like an improvised asylum and more like a laboratory where consent is being tested and defined. We practice. We rehearse ways of saying yes and no. There is a kind of learning to not assume protection equates to affection. We both remind one another when words blur.
Consent, as it turns out, is not a single signature, but a continuous practice. Keys, signed agreements, independent logs, they are instruments to keep that practice honest. Still, the market we are trying to remove ourselves from does not pause for our experiments. Calibre is patient in the way of predators with capital. It prefers small erosion to dramatic theft. It sends tenders and tests. A probe arrives at the edge of the week in a form that is almost polite, a vehicle that slows, then speeds, its pattern designed not to make headlines, but to map patterns. Marco notices it first. He texts Dante at 2 a.m. Car 2 blocks east, slow circle, license plates obscured. Dante wakes me, not with a rush, but a clear, procedural update. He says we were tested. We view the footage together, though I want to look away. The clip is unremarkable in any cinematic sense. A car in the rain, and then it stops a block away. A man lifting his phone and angling it down. The metadata shows it was within the time frame our own cameras picked up, but the image is jittery, and the sound is a wash of rain. It is exactly the kind of evidence that invites interpretation without decisive proof. Calibre's method, I've learned, is to create doubt, and to fund it with the kind of reasonable deniability that public discourse loves. Dante does not pull strings in that moment. He files the footage to the archivist and marks it as probe, nonviolent. He suggests a defensive move that is procedural rather than theatrical. We document the pattern, we notify local counsel, and we prepare to move from private mitigation to institutional accountability if the pattern escalates. He refuses the language of retaliation. Instead, he wants thresholds, 3 probes, or an explicit data leak, or a physical act, and then we escalate to a formal complaint. I like the thresholds. They feel like the kind of restraint a person who understands the danger of power might employ. I also feel a different tendency rising in me, the urge to go public. There is a dangerous logic that hides behind that urge. If the cameras cannot be bought by those who profit from their footage, perhaps the glare will become a form of safety. Dante argues against that kind of calculus. Exposure can be negotiated by the market too. There is no virtue in hurling oneself into a storm of attention meant to punish. We are learning, slowly and awkwardly, the difference between being seen by the world and choosing to be seen. There is a small victory that week, a case I think of often. Marco intercepts a text that would have been a leak, a private image slated for circulation. He intercepts it and flags the origin. They trace it through a series of shell accounts and reach a vendor who had sold footage to an aggregator with links to Calibre. We do not make a spectacle of it. We send the chain of evidence to the archivist, who boxes it and timestamps it and marks it for possible legal use. There is a bureaucratic satisfaction to this. It is not a triumphant headline. It is paper and time and the slow accumulation of proof. But danger is patient. The probe at the gate is followed by an incident that is less ambiguous. The car that sits outside for an hour, its driver reading a message, and then a man on the sidewalk who lingers long enough to be called suspicious by a neighbor. Marco wants to confront him. Dante says no. He reminds us of the rules and of the plan. Evidence, not confrontation. There is a moral grammar here that protects us from becoming what we fight. He says we will not be the people who take the law into our own hands. Despite that, paranoia becomes tactile. I find myself checking the windows at night, my fingers tracing the cold metal of the key in my pocket like a talisman. The key is both ridiculous and sacred. Ridiculous because in a world of digital contracts and public statements, a small piece of metal should not feel like the last sentence. Sacred because it is the physical reminder that consent is something I carry with me. I keep it in the pocket of a dress, and every time my hand brushes it, I remember I have the right to leave. There are small, intimate moments that complicate everything else.
Dante is not a man who uses compliments the way my husband once did at placations. He does not serenade me with public lines. He is practical in his affection, if affection is what we call the act of learning boundaries together. Once, in the greenhouse, he hands me a sprig of rosemary from a plant Rosa tends because I told her once I liked its scent. I smell the herb, and for the blink of a second the world tightens into a private, ordinary delight. The scent of lemon oil mixing with rosemary, damp soil underfoot, the slow ripple of water in the cistern. Those images are small economies of trust. But nothing in the week is exempt from being commodified. I get a message from a contact in marketing. There was a whisper piece today about a fracture in my public life. It is not accusatory so much as inquisitive, inviting gossip into the shape of a question. The text includes a suggestion. This would be a good moment to stage a public reaffirmation. My public marriage appears, from the outside, steady. I feel my mouth form words that are no longer entirely mine. In the echo of that message, I consider for a beat whether staying within the marriage for appearances feels safer than the unknown I have chosen by stepping into Dante's house. It is exactly then that someone from Calabre chooses to make a more formal probe. A package arrives at the house, left at the gate in the rain. Marco finds it during his patrol. It is unremarkable at first. A letter, an envelope with a lucid, curated threat rather than blunt force. The letter details what they could do, a diagram of the market's capabilities, a list of platforms where content could be placed, the price of erasure versus exposure.
The letter is not violent, but it is surgical. It knows where I am most vulnerable. Dante does not fake outrage. He files the letter with the archivist, seals copies, and notifies counsel. He calls me by my name in a way that is earnest and low. We will not be surprised into submission. He speaks of the law like someone who knows both its limits and its work. It will not move with theater, but neither will it allow anonymous markets to operate in total impunity if the evidence can be marshaled and if someone with standing makes the case. He drafts a plan. Gather the patterns, preserve the logs, document the chain of custody, and then choose a legal forum where the facts are more likely to be weighed than the spin to be shaped. There is a moral flame to this strategy that I find both thrilling and exasperating. Thrilling because it dignifies the notion that law, for all its slowness, is a way of exposing machinery. Exasperating because it requires patience, and patience sometimes feels like complicity in being harmed. When the week comes to an end, when the 7 days I traded for this strange provisional shelter reach their numerical conclusion, there is no moment of triumphant exit. I do not march out to a crowd. The week has altered me in quiet ways more than in public ones. Dante returns the key to me in the kitchen, where the kettle is a gentle hiss in the background, and Rosa is drying a cub. He does something that would have surprised my former public self. He sets a small, new key on the table beside the old one. It is engraved not with my name, but with a single word we agreed on: exit. He watches my face as I hold both keys, and I understand the ritual of the gesture. He has said he would accept oversight. He has shown it. He has admitted a breach and made reparations for one. But the larger pattern of pressure from Calabre continues to be patient and methodical. The end of the week does not resolve the longer arc. Outside the house, the world keeps trading in reputations, and my public life is a ledger that other hands can try to edit. There is an architectural truth to that week. Protection can be a place to practice consent, but it is not by itself an eradication of the market that eats privacy. On the last night before I make the choice to move forward, Marco brings me a note he found in a mailbox on his rounds. A simple slip that reads, "We know where you go." It is not specific. It is a whisper from the machinery we are up against. I press both keys into my palm and feel their cold against my skin. They are tokens of a contract that is still being written. I do not know in that moment whether the next move is to take this to the public in a way that will expose Calabre's methods, or to move toward a legal remedy that will bind the network into a process of accountability. Both belong to a moral calculus I had not been invited to make when the marriage was shaped and promoted for consumption. Both require time, evidence, and allies. Dante does not ask me to decide alone. He suggests, as he had been suggesting since the curb, a path that sacrifices drama for the mechanics of consequence. Preserve the archives, strengthen the chain of custody, approach counsel, and, if evidence supports it, bring the matter into a courtroom where the facts might do their own convincing. He admits again, with a kind of weary clarity, that he has a past that complicates his credibility. He offers transparency as the thing that might, in time, remedy that. It is not redemption, he says. It is accountability. Rosa sets a cup of tea beside me. The steam fogs a small circle on the wooden table. I watch the motion of the kettle, the way Marco folds a napkin to the precise right angle,
And I think of small domestic movements as moral practice. They are not theater. They are the work that keeps privacy from becoming a commodity. We are at a threshold when the phone rings. It is a number I do not recognize, and a voice that does not hide its interest. There is an unnamed journalist on the other end. No, not exactly curious, rather hungry. I imagine the words she could write. I imagine the headlines that could reduce all the mess into a 2-line piece, the kind that will be retweeted with cheap moral certainties. I keep both keys in my hand and listen as the one asks a question that presumes the answer she wants. Is there a fracture in the marriage? For a long moment, I do not answer. The question is precise and designed to weaponize the private. It asks me to compress complexity into an image that will sell. I have traded a public image of perfection once, and I have no intention of reenacting it for someone else's gain. I close my hand around the keys and think of the ledger, of the archivist, of the way Dante called his methods into question and accepted oversight. I think of Rosa and Marco, of the greenhouse light and the lemon oil, of the small acts that make a life one's own. When I finally speak into the receiver, my voice is steady. I tell the journalist that our focus is not on spectacle, but on accountability. I tell her there are patterns we will document and consequences we will pursue if the facts justify them. I tell her, without theatricality, that protection cannot be ownership. It is a sentence I am constructing not for anyone else but for myself. The world wants stories with tidy arcs. We are trying to build something that resists tidy endings. The call ends. I put the phone down and look out at the rain. The key rests like a small argument in my palm. The choice ahead is a trade. Perhaps the title of this moment will be The Socialite Who Traded the Perfect Marriage for Secret Nights. It is a headline possibility, a tidy line, but it obscures more than it reveals.
What I traded was not a marriage out of malice or theater. I traded a performance that had hollowed me out for a week of negotiated privacy, where I could relearn what consent looked like in practice. There is no tidy resolution. There is only a coming step. The probe at the gate is not solved by a week, and Calabre's patience is a problem that requires more than a single bargain. I stand, and Dante sits across from me in the kitchen, watching the slow onion of steam from our cups. He reaches out but stops short of touching the small keys in my hand. We have bound ourselves to certain words and documents, but the market of reputation will meet procedure with its own patience. Outside, a car passes slowly, the rain blurring its taillights into streaks. I slip both keys into my pocket, not as a surrender to fate, but as a daily practice of boundary, tangible, heavy, and ultimately mine to use. The week has ended, and the city is no kinder for it, but the ledger is growing. The archivist has begun to accumulate a record. Rosa and Marco have become team and testament, and Dante has committed his faults to paper and consequence. We have started to translate private harm into the language of evidence. A new message pings on the house tablet, an email from the archivist confirming the registry of the probe, the unauthorized access, and the letter left at the gate. There is a line at the bottom of the archivist's note that is, in its own way, a kind of counsel. If pattern escalates, recommend civil action and criminal referral. The words are crisp. They have the advantage of being boring. That boringness may be our most radical tool. I walk to the greenhouse and stand among the humid leaves. The plants do not ask for narratives. They do not care whether a life is advertised as perfect. They grow stubborn in the dark, making green out of damp and time. I rest my fingertips on a pot and think about the day I will have to choose between a public legal fight and a quieter, incremental accumulation of proof that will, one day, attempt to hold a network accountable. The rain slows. The city lights blur into something less prosecutorial than they have been. The keys in my pocket are a reminder that, for now, I have an exit. But an exit is not a cure. Probe, letter, pattern. These things will require more than 1 week to correct. They will require evidence, strategy, and the willingness to put the intimate mechanics of harm on a ledger where someone uninvolved can see them. Someone knocks at the gate. Marco answers with a cautious voice. A courier outside asks for directions to the back of the house and then leaves. I watch him go, the slow tilt of a hat, the way a man with no interest other than to place a package can be mistaken for something else. The knock is an incitement to action, but not yet a crisis. Inside, Dante pours another cup of tea. He sets it down across from me without making any claim to familiarity that would eclipse the agreement we share. He says, simply, "We can do this the slow way or the loud way." Spectacle replace accountability. It is the opening stanza of a longer, more bureaucratic fight. Subpoenas, depositions, a neutral archivist's ledger used in court as evidence, counsel drafting civil claims and criminal referrals. It will be, by design, a procedural and therefore slower path. We begin to prepare. Marco organizes physical evidence, Rosa compiles lists of dates and visitors, Dante drafts a short memo that summarizes what has happened and what he has offered as remedial steps. I pull my wedding band from my finger and place it on the table. I do not know whether the band will become a symbol in the narratives that follow. For some it will be the sign of a perfect marriage broken, for others the proof that a woman once traded a life of performance for something that felt more true. I leave it there, and I press the keys into my hand. The protocol is in motion. The archivist confirms receipt of the seed files. Marco contacts a lawyer who specializes in digital evidence and intimate privacy. We set thresholds for escalation: 3 probes, hard evidence of data distribution, or a physical threat. The week I accepted for protection was a starting point, not an answer. The ledger is accruing. The key is a practice. The greenhouse smells faintly of earth and water, and the rain is a constant music that has taught me to count days differently. And yet, as we move from preparation to action, a different kind of tension arrives, the unnameable one that exists between desire and duty. There are nights in which the thought of returning to the arms of a perfect marriage feels like stepping into a wardrobe of costumes I no longer fit. There are nights when the touch of a stranger, or the small kindness of Rosa, or Dante's careful restraint feels like a possibility of something private that is not meant for sales. I have traded one performance for a set of secret nights and a ledger. Both are fraught. The rain begins to pick up again, as if punctuating the point. I turn the keys in my pocket once, twice, feeling the metal against my palm. They are a grammar I can rely on, a way to negotiate consent in a world that would treat me as inventory. The house hums, and outside, the city will continue to try to buy and sell the private details it can extract.
Inside, we are learning to transform private grievance into public evidence, and to do so without letting the market dictate the terms of our dignity. A car light slices across the wet drive, the rhythm of an approaching presence. Marco moves to the window, and Dante stands. I heft the keys in my palm like a small, stubborn argument. I have the right to walk away, to set limits, to demand that systems designed to punish the private be held to account. The week has taught me that protection without oversight becomes a new form of possession, and that possession is no substitute for consent. We step toward the door together, practical, not heroic, and in the kitchen, the extra engraved key cools in the tea steam, as if waiting for me to decide whether to keep it or not. The knock at the gate is the same as before, but edged now with the knowledge that this is only the beginning of a longer cataloging process, a slow, patient accrual of facts and witness. The ledger will have pages yet to fill. The keys in my pocket feel like a vow to that process. We open the door. We open the door. A woman in a raincoat pauses on the step, then moves on when Marco asks her business. The house inhales the smell of wet clothes and tea. The evening is ordinary and small in a way that feels now like a strategy. We lock the door behind us with a kind of collective patience. The world outside keeps its markets and its hunger. Inside, we keep the ledger. The archivist's email arrives that night at 2 a.m. Pattern registered. Recommend civil referral. Criminal if escalation continues. It is the kind of bureaucratic sentence that should be dull but feels dangerous because it names a next step. Counsel, competent, precise, and unimaginative in all the ways that make a good lawyer, advises we prepare deposition statements and gather all chain of custody documentation. There are photographs of the letter left at the gate, images of the probe car, metadata from our cameras, and a careful record of Dante's access attempt. Things we once thought private become exhibits. The work is tedious and necessary. I make a list of people who will know what to do with this kind of accumulation. Lena, the journalist who would later write a piece that complicated the public narrative, suggests names of lawyers and civic advocates. She understands that stories are not simply consumed, they are instruments for accountability if they are treated as evidence and not spectacle. She asks to see the archivist's hub, to understand the methodology of duplication and timestamping that will make our files useful in a courtroom. We arrange for a secure visit. The archivist is a person whose presence is felt more than seen at first.
He or she, the pronouns seem unnecessarily small when placed against the weight of the ledger, works from a windowless office that looks like 3 decades of data hygiene. Intact shelving, labeled boxes, a server rack that hums like a compliant insect. The archivist explains technical things in a voice that is both literal and oddly moral. Hashes, write-one storage, mirrored copies stored off-site with blind trustees. There is an elegance to the boredom. We make things boring, the archivist says, smiling, because boring is reliable. That reliability feels like an ethical stance. We file a complaint with the district attorney's office. The DA's intake is procedural, the sort of small room seriousness that breathes out paperwork and breathes in sworn statements. An intake officer listens to me describe the markets that traffic in private moments as if they are the weather, ubiquitous, ordinary, avoidable only by small acts of defense. I hand over the archivist's initial registry. The DA's face remains neutral. Neutrality is the institutional posture that allows law to do its work if evidence travels with it. What happens next is the dogged, unromantic grind of systematized truth. Subpoenas go out for servers and accounts. Forensic imaging is requested of devices seized from vendors we've traced through the chain of sales Marco discovered. The archivist's immutability argument, its time-stamped hashes, becomes a document the DA trusts enough to present to a grand jury. Calibre, which had preferred to be an invisible apparatus, is now named in motions and filings with the sort of slow formality that can feel like a reprieve. Naming a structure makes it legible to institutions whose business is naming and remedy. The first public reaction comes in an oblique wave. Social media piles its guesses and its small cruelties on top of whatever concrete legal action exists. There are threads that rerun the old narratives, placeholders for scandal. An anonymous influencer posts a video with a coy voiceover, a marriage, a fixer, and a mystery. The video is designed to create heat without light. It makes insinuation feel like news. Calibre's operators, practiced consumers of culture, fund friendlies, accounts that echo questions, plant seeds of doubt. The smear machine is not a single boogeyman. It is a market of small, paid provocations designed to erode credibility precisely where credibility is thin. Lena weds a counterpiece. She does not write a puff profile. She traces the money, the shell vendors, and the list of vendors we unearthed because of Marco's interception and the archivist's ledger. She does something that feels rare in the press. She names the technical means of obfuscation, proxy accounts, resellers, bundled rights, without offering a spectacle. She shows how a private image becomes product through a series of small institutional choices.
Her piece complicates the gossip and gives readers the vocabulary to understand what was being sold. It does not make the markets disappear, but it turns the smear into a working document for reform-minded people. The DA's office moves deliberately. They convene a grand jury, not for the romance of it, but because they need witnesses and subpoenas to build a criminal case. Dante and I sit across from a prosecutor who is not theatrical. She is a woman whose manner is unflashy and efficient. She asks precise questions about dates, about the sequence of evidence, about chain of custody. Her voice flattens whatever mythology might prefer drama and replaces it with depositions. The archivist provides logs with hashed timestamps. Marco signs affidavits. Rosa corroborates details of the house's access controls. The collection of witnesses reads like a tableau domestic labor, that is to say, like the stuff of everyday truth, and its ordinariness gives it heft. During the grand jury period, Calibre escalates. It is not violent in a way that reads as a pulp narrative. It is procedural and cruel. We are on our way to an appointment when the car behind us flickers its lights and then boxes us in at a junction. The van that moves in is a banal gray thing with no markings. A man leans out of the passenger door and yells something inaudible. Someone, two people, slam into our bumper with a force that jars and throws the interior glass into a spiderweb. Marco brakes hard, and the world stutters. A raised piece of metal clatters across the road. We are shaken but not seriously hurt. The car has its airbags unrolled and the smell of dust. The attacker does not attempt to kidnap or to beat us to death. Their tactic is intimidation. They want to make clear that someone has the physical capacity to rearrange our day. We go to the hospital for scans. The next day, the police come, kind and routine. They photograph the damage. A detective who is slow and competent takes a taped interview and asks for our account. The forensics team retrieves paint transfer and glass shards. They trace tire marks. It is the kind of evidence that does not make headlines but makes emotion in court plausible. Here are physical acts that can be linked to actors, and they are not just online insinuations. It is also the moment I understand with the full weight that the market does not only cost privacy, it endangers bodies. The attack could have been worse, and that contingency sits like a weight in my chest. We add this incident to the ledger. The archivist timestamps photos of the car's damage and cross-references a set of plate sightings Marco recorded earlier. The DA treats the ambush as a serious escalation. It is not an isolated burst of cruelty, but a pattern. As the grand jury meets, Dante faces his own histories under the prosecutorial light. He is not a man without crimes. He acknowledges that.
The DA's office is clear-eyed about his culpability and negotiates a path that balances his cooperation with the need for consequence. The bargaining table is unromantic and lined with papers that smell like institutional resolve. Dante offers to cooperate fully, to identify vendors, to provide timelines, and to place himself under a set of business restrictions while the markets that supplied the industry are investigated. The DA offers a plea arrangement that is strict but not draconian, guilty pleas to a package of offenses that include unauthorized acquisition of protected private materials and conspiracy to facilitate their distribution, restitution funds to victims, mandatory audits, and a court-appointed monitor for any business interests he retains, community service coupled with training programs for security operators, and crucially, the funding of a new foundation dedicated to survivors and systemic reforms. The foundation is to be seeded by Dante as part of his restitution. The DA makes clear that legal consequences will be public and recorded. The plea is not redemption. It reads on paper the way adult consequences do. Not theatrical absolution, but a series of constraints, watchers, and funds disgorged to repair harm. The choice is both moral and strategic. Dante offers something that ties institutional consequence to institutional remedy. He does not avoid the law, he volunteers to be bound by it. We prepare for the hearing. I meet with counsel and rehearse testimonies. Testimony is an art of withholding and revealing with an eye toward stability. There is a scene in court where I sit on the witness stand with my hands folded and try to translate months of erosion into sentences the judge will accept as concrete rather than metaphor. There are descriptions of the letter at the gate, the probe car, the ambush. I read aloud the archivist's log and then stand to show digitally hashed copies of the same files submitted as exhibits. The judge, who is older and unimpressed with rhetoric, leans in at several points, tapping the bench when evidence is clarified. Dante stands, confesses in measured language, and presents his cooperation as a ledger of the past, names he hands over, vendors who sold to resellers, payments traced through accounts. The DA's office uses these as the scaffolding for an indictment that reaches into the underpinnings of reputation markets. The hearing itself is a public moment, but it is not a spectacle. The press arrives and records it, but Lena's piece is there to give context to the subtleties the tabloids ignore. She writes about the way accountability can be procedural and quiet, and how the real battle is often over the mundane integrity of chain of custody. Her piece is read widely among people who make policy. It gives the foundation a kind of legitimacy that helps in its initial fundraising, because donors want the certainty of structure. Dante pleads. The judge sentences with a voice that is precise and unusually humane. He orders restitution, restricted operations, mandatory audits, and community service paired with educational initiatives aimed at the security and data industries. He approves the DA's proposed oversight mechanism, a court-appointed compliance board with power to audit Dante's remaining interests. There are fines and enforcement. There is no miraculous corporate collapse of Calibre. Markets are stubborn and adaptive. But individual vendors named in the indictments face civil suits and criminal referrals. The law, in this instance, bites into the network and leaves scars that can be used for further regulation. After the hearing, the newspapers ask the question the world wants. What will the woman who had the perfect marriage do now? The headlines are simpler than the truth. I do not own a single tidy answer. The legal result is not triumph. It is a framework. The ambush remained a threat. The ledger remains a task. And the foundation is an instrument that will require work beyond the initial headline cycle. We begin the foundation in rooms that are too small for the ambitions we have. Our charter is a document written in a language that insists on survivor leadership, on independent auditors, and on protections against the very abuses that had once afflicted me. We argue in board meetings over the composition of the board with the scrupulousness of people who know how easily good intentions can be sold back to predators. We insist that survivors compose a majority of voting members. Rosa argues for the practical. If we don't put people who do the work in charge, we'll make a charity instead of a repair shop. I push for legal safeguards, blind trustees, an archivist seat with veto power over data handling, clear intake protocols that avoid re-traumatization. Marco says quietly that he wants to put resource into training programs so that survivors can learn to protect their own evidence. Dante funds the seed money, but accepts that he will not sit on a board. Instead, he provides a set of endowed positions that will be administered by an independent trustee. There are donor discussions that verge on farce. Corporations that wanted to write off donations in exchange for PR go away when they read our charter. We make a point of refusing money that requires editorial control. We accept grants from legal defense funds, from philanthropic organizations with a commitment to digital privacy,
and from private donors who are willing to put money behind a set of constraints we can enforce. A modest pile of money appears, and with it the machinery of programs, an emergency fund for people whose private images are about to be distributed, a legal aid arm that will subsidize civil claims, a training program for law enforcement on handling intimate privacy cases with sensitivity, and a policy initiative aimed at regulating resale markets and data brokers.
The archivist becomes the Foundation's technical director, a role that sits oddly between moral authority and technical pedantry. In public, we speak about evidence stewardship because it is a phrase that holds both ethics and process. The archivist builds intake forms that guide survivors through a non-invasive submission process, employing write-once storage and timestamped mirroring. Survivors who come in are met by Rosa at intake. She has an informal tenderness that is practical. She makes tea, offers a quiet chair, and helps people decide whether, when, and how to involve law. Marco trains volunteers on security detail that is proportional and non-intrusive. Our programs are small but measured, designed for sustainability, not for optics. We also create a legal fellowship program to help young lawyers learn how to litigate intimate privacy cases. Dante funds internships and curriculum. The DA's office partners with us on policy recommendations, and in one city council hearing, a modest regulation requiring transparency from third-party brokers who sell private content and a right of reply for victims passes into local law. It is not sweeping reform, but it is a crack in the dam. We file an amicus brief in a related case and lend our archivists' technical affidavits to a judge who had not known how to treat hashed logs. Those small wins accumulate. But the Foundation is not a cure-all. Board meetings are tiresome in the way reform often is. Disagreements about donor vetting, debates about survivor confidentiality, discussions about whether to litigate aggressively or to focus on policy. We fight petty and large battles about mission drift. There are temperamental arguments over whether funds should be allocated to public education campaigns, expensive and high profile, or to direct legal aid, slow and invisible. Consensus forms in an exhausted way. We fund both, but on careful terms. We insist on independent auditors to check that our intake process does not create new vulnerabilities. Rosa finds a case that becomes our first visible success. A woman comes in, hands trembling, because private images of her had been sold in a circle that included a small ender we had traced. She had been judged and shamed and had fled her job. We assemble a team. The archivist confirms the chain of custody using our mirrored copies. Council files an emergency injunction to stop distributors. Marco and secured volunteers coordinate protective measures. The injunction is granted because the judge sees a clear chain of evidence, the kind the archivist specializes in. The distributor pays damages and shuts down the account. The woman returns to a life that is, in small ways, more like her own again. It is not a cinematic rescue. It is a court order, letters to platforms, filters and takedowns, and a lot of bureaucratic follow-through. I think about how small, drab, and essential this work is. In the shadows, Calibre reorganizes. Some vendors fold.
Others change names. The network is resilient. Dante gives names to the DA that result in smaller indictments and a few civil suits against resellers. The markets push back with legal teams, with smear accounts, and with protesters who claim we are censoring speech. The Foundation holds fast to survivor leadership and to the archivist's technical doctrine. We are careful to separate our advocacy from personal revenge. We lose donors along the way because the fights are not always pretty. We also gain allies, lawyers who want to learn the craft of intimate privacy litigation, survivors who become board members, and activists who find the mixed language of law and care useful. The public angle remains complicated. At a regional charity dinner 9 months after the hearing, I am asked to speak about finding strength. There is a moment before I go on stage where the band plays something bright and polite, and my dress feels like a uniform. Flora, a survivor board member, whispers to me that she will sit up front. The night is packed with people who like being seen for their generosity. I walk on stage and give a short speech about institutional repair and the need to translate private harm into public evidence. I do not give the speech I could have, which would be simpler and more performative. I give a speech that nuances the idea of protection versus possession. There are polite applause and the necessary guest photos afterwards. I leave the stage without a hug from a person who might have once called himself my husband in public, and I do not feel the theatrical weight of that absence as much as I feel an odd weather of relief. The press still wants a different story, the narrative of a woman who traded a perfect marriage for secret nights. It is an appealing trope. For some people, the secret nights are romance. For others, they are scandal. Neither captures what I learned about consent and ledgered oversight. The Foundation's work is not a secret romance nor a scandal. It is an institutional attempt to translate harm into a public record so the law can do something with it. When Lena writes about us, she resists the easy line and instead shows the slow accumulation of evidence and the human labor that makes it possible. Dante's life changes in measured ways. He accepts the court's restrictions and the monitoring board. He has to strip his businesses of certain contracts and allow audits. He does not vanish into anonymity. He becomes an awkward benefactor with limits. He funds the foundation but does not receive credit for it in press releases. He takes community service teaching data protection practices to security teams, a work that humbles him. The DA's arrangement includes an obligation for him to fund trauma-informed training. He attends each session and teaches from experience. His past missteps are presented not as exculpatory lore, but as case studies of what to avoid. There is friction. At times his presence stirs board unease.
We keep him at arm's length from governance, bound by the trust and the restrictions we insisted upon. There are nights, few, carefully chosen, when Dante and I share dinner. They are not clandestine adventures. They are conversations that have been negotiated beforehand, when phones are left in a basket at the kitchen door, how we agree to handle messages, what to do if someone shows up at the house. We define what is public and what is private each time. There is tenderness in the way that, over time, the rituals of consent become their own sort of intimacy. He makes a small, careful gesture. He brings pot roast to the greenhouse table on a rainy night, and I show him a new ledger entry on my phone that notes a policy victory. It is not the stuff of romantic movies. It is repair and work and a lightness that has to be cultivated like a plant. One afternoon on the roof, where the house frames the city like a distance, we have a conversation that feels like a hinge. The roof is wind-exposed, warm brick underfoot. The greenhouse's heat breathes up the stairwell like a whisper. I consider the two keys I have kept, the plain, unadorned one Dante pressed into my palm on the curb, and the engraved exit key he set beside the kettle when the week ended. I take them out now and set them on the parapet. The keys, in all their smallness, have accumulated layers of meaning, a literal right to leave, and a symbolic shorthand for consent. Dante sits a few feet away, his hands cupped around a mug. He asks me, without melodrama, how I imagine our presence in public. I tell him I do not imagine performances. I imagine work. I imagine evenings where we do not have to perform resilience to entertain donors. He says that he does not want to be a thing that owns me, or that anyone else can point to as a bargaining chip. He confesses that his past reflexes are his to answer for, and he accepts the court's restrictions as accountability rather than punishment. There is a quiet honesty to him that lives in the space between sentences. We carve out a new grammar. He offers me the extra key, the one engraved exit, with the clause that it can be used unilaterally and will, if necessary, trigger an immediate protective protocol from the Foundation's security arm. I return the gesture with a different token, a small coded agreement that details thresholds for public appearance together and guidelines for intimate privacy. It is not romanticized. It is contractual, domestic, and oddly comforting. We agree that public attention will be for the Foundation's mission and not for our private companionship. We define our nights together as nights of mutual negotiation. A handshake for leaving a bed feels absurd until it feels right as a practice. Consent becomes not the romantic climax of a plot, but a language we use every day. There are slippages, not because of malice, but because old patterns are sticky.
A journalist obtains a draft email in which Dante, in haste, used a persuasive tone to a small vendor about a payment schedule. The email is innocent in context, but can be framed as coercive out of context. Dante emails the archivist immediately, reports the incident to the compliance board, and offers to step down from an operational role for a probationary period. The board accepts and tightens the editorial protections around correspondence. It is not the breach of a camera feed, it is the slyness of influence. The remediation is public and procedural. We post the archived log and the board's admonition. The point is not to punish theatrically, but to show that remedial structures are enforceable. Months go by with a mix of slow victories and bureaucratic frustrations. Policy proposals creep into local law. A vendor or two go out of business. Others rebrand. The archivist testifies before a legislative committee about the need for standard practices in evidence preservation. Marco develops a curriculum for security teams that focuses on proportional response and the ethics of presence. Rosa becomes our intake director and teaches a generation of staff about small rituals that matter: tea, a warm chair, privacy screens, and clear consent forms. The Foundation's pilot projects help several people obtain injunctions, modest monetary relief, and the dignity of anonymity regained on social platforms. None of it is broadcast as a triumph. It is slow, incremental, and the sort of work that accrues moral capital in small denominations. We return to the public sometimes, on our own terms. At a modest gala a year after the initial curb, we arrive not as a reunified tableau of a perfect marriage, but as co-chairs of a foundation that lists survivors first. Photographs are taken. They are flattering and incomplete.
In the green room, I hold my keys in my pocket and feel the weight of them like a grammar I no longer need to explain. A woman approaches me and says quietly that she found the intake page and got help. She thanks me with an economy of gratitude that is not performative. I realize the foundation has done tangible work, a few lives nudged back towards self-determination. It is enough in the way that small, concrete triumphs are enough. The public still loves tidy stories. The headline writers offer their versions anyway. The socialite who traded the perfect marriage for secret nights. It is a neat hook, but inside the ledger keeps growing. The archivist emails a quarterly report with hashes and case notes. The DA's office files follow-ups with additional vendors identified because of Dante's cooperation. The compliance board meets quarterly and posts redacted minutes. We publish annual reports with survivor-forward language and independent audits. The foundation is audited and re-audited. It grows in modest, careful ways. Dante and I continue to learn the language of ongoing consent. There are meals scheduled, then canceled.
There are stairs walked together, and then left alone. When we sleep within the same roof, a small note is left on the counter the next morning. 2 words sometimes. Thank you, which is a practice as much as an affection. We never confuse presence for ownership. The keys remain in my pocket like a punctuation mark. On a Sunday morning months later, Rosa and I alphabetize intake files. The kettle hisses and a gray light falls across the greenhouse where a volunteer is pruning. We find a file from a woman whose images had been sold by a reseller with links to Calibre. The case had been slow, expensive, and emotionally costly. The foundation supported her with legal help and counseling, and through a combination of injunctions and platform takedowns, we secured cease and desist orders and an apology that had the stickiness of a court order. We close the file in an afternoon ritual that feels more like an act of care than a victory. I leave the file in the cabinet and think of the smallness of the victory. A life steadied, not cured. There are days when I still wonder about the public marriage I once wore so well. I have a ritual for those doubts. I take the keys from my pocket and hold them in the palm of my hand, weighing the metal as if to test the heft of a decision. The keys have been a practice more than a symbol. Each time I turn them over, I remember that consent is not a signature, but an ongoing agreement. The foundation is an extension of that belief, that systems can be reshaped by evidence, that survivors require both care and the boring machinery of law, and that protection is not the same as possession. We are never wholly safe. The market is adaptive and patient. Calibre morphs and rescripts. But there is a ledger now that did not exist before, and there are protocols in place that make it harder for private harms to be erased into rumor. There are survivors who finally sleep. There are training sessions that teach security operators to prioritize de-escalation over bravado. There is a city council that adds modest regulatory teeth to an industry that had been almost entirely private and ungoverned. These are small triumphs, procedural and slow. But in their sum, they are structural. The final scene that matters to me is not the courtroom or the gala, but a kitchen moment that speaks to the everydayness of new terms. We make tea at noon. The rain has returned to a fine, steady pattern. Marco chops bread. Rosa brines lemons for a salad. The archivist is on the phone ordering secure drives. Dante leans against the counter and jokes about a failed soufflé he once attempted. I set the keys on the table where they have been 100 times before, and then walk away from them to wash a cup. The kitchen hums with small tasks and small necessary attention.
Later, when we stand on the roof for the first anniversary of the filing, an occasion we do not mark publicly but that matters like an internal calendar, we do a small thing that feels right. Dante takes from his pocket a little object, the extra key he gave me months earlier, and presses it into my hand. It is not a dramatic gift, it is a confirmation of contract. We have simplified the language into something tactile. The keys are ours, but I alone carry the right to use them. He asks me quietly whether, given the foundation's growth and the court's oversight, I would prefer that we appear publicly together as co-chairs for one event a year to speak about institutional repair. I say yes, because I believe our presence can move policy in small ways. I say yes because the public can be a lever for reform when we define the terms. On the roof, the city breathes. It is a soft, distant noise, not a crowd. I turn my pockets inside out and feel the cold metal against my palm. The keys are heavy in the right way. They are a daily practice of agency.
They are an explicit refusal to allow protection to become possession. They remind me that a week of negotiated nights did not create a new life overnight. It opened a space in which I could rehearse saying no, and then yes, and then no again. We return to public life on terms that we forge through paperwork, through meetings, through patient accumulation of evidence. We do not step into a neat reconciliation with the marriage that was once displayed for applause. Sometimes the thought of slipping back into that costume feels like a betrayal of what I learned under the greenhouse light. Other times, the quiet companionship of a negotiated dinner with Dante feels like the only private thing I have left. It is not tidy. It is as complicated as the ledger. At the Foundation's annual report reading, we publish an appendix with redacted hashes and a technical note from the archivist about how evidence is preserved. It is an odd inclusion for a charity report, but we want to teach people what a chain of custody can look like. The press notices it. There are still op-eds that reduce the story to romantic shorthand, but there are policy papers that quote our archivist. We measure our success not by headlines, but by the number of injunctions issued, by the survivors who tell us they sleep through a night, by the slight drop in vendor registrations in the datasets the DA collects. Those are the numerical metrics that mean something. At night, I walk the greenhouse path and touch the rosemary that still lives in its pot. The scent is the same as that first week. Lemon oil, damp soil, rosemary, things that do not ask to be marketable. I feel my fingers close around the key in my pocket, and for a moment the world simplifies into the small sharp objects of living. A kettle hiss, a folded napkin, the ledger's dull glow on a screen. The key is not a final answer. It is a practice of exit and a promise of agency.
The markets remain hungry. They will adapt. But we have a ledger now, and a foundation, and a public narrative that refuses to reduce private harm to salacious headlines. We have created a grammar for consent that insists on being documented and enforced. We have taught a group of people that protection must be accountable to law and to independent observers. When the chapter closes that people will call the week, I know that my life is not a neat trade-off of marriage for secret nights. I traded a performance for a rehearsal in consent, for practices that allowed me to live within my own boundaries. I helped build an institution that aims imperfectly to take private harm out of a market and place it into a court of facts and into the care of survivors. The work is slow, and there are nights when the weight of it exhausts me. But there are also mornings when a woman who once had her life sold back to her can come into the office and find a steward who helps her file evidence without shame. Those mornings keep me going. We are careful in the public spaces now. At an event where we present a new city policy proposal, I clasp my keys in my palm and step to the podium, not as an ornament, but as someone who helped build a process. A photographer takes the picture people will crop and caption, and the line makers will invent their versions. That is their right. My right is to keep the ledger and to insist on structures that translate harm into work a court or a council can act upon. I do not have a tidy closure, and I do not want one. In the end, the key remains. It is the small legal fiction that became an instrument of practice. It does not guarantee safety. It guarantees the possibility of exit and the clarity of terms. It is a device to remind me that consent is negotiated every day and that repair is procedural, not miraculous. If you want more character-driven stories about danger, longing, and the slow law of repair, there are others worth reading. For now, I put the keys back into my pocket, where they hinge like a private punctuation between who I used to be and who I am trying to become.